I'm extremely honored and surprised to be giving this talk at this anniversary of the EPS. Had I known I'd be around when the EPS was so old, I would have thought differently about it. As it was, I suppose I must be one of the few people who remember it when meetings, particularly in Cambridge, used to be of about 12 people. It seemed very much more because of the monstrous egos in the room, principally Tony Deutsch and Stuart Sutherland. And the EPS has been praised and blamed for many things, blamed particularly by Hans Eysenck for interrupting his meteoric progress to the head of his profession in Britain. But I've dealt with this in a paper in Cause, Introduction to Eysenck's Life. The only thing I have to say is that both Dorothy and I, like so many hundreds of others, have found that the EPS was a constant source of stimulation when we were isolated in our departments and had few people in our subjects to speak of. It was a reliable source of interaction. And to use the phrase often used about it in those days, that it was a society for self-advancement and the consumption of alcohol, is, I think, unfair. Okay, I'll get on with this. I'm dating this exploration of the study of cognitive aging in the last century and this from the 1980s. Jim Birren had two ideas, basically. One was that neurophysiological indicators, at least sensory and motor indicators, would predict your age status. And he noticed that age predicts loss of sensory and motor efficiency. So if you're measuring these things, then if you take age changes in hearing, vision and balance, partly they'll be caused by peripheral changes in the eyes, ears, etc. You have cornea scratching and loss of otoliths and earwax even. And they may also in part be caused by brain changes. But we can't know this unless we also have and include in our studies some direct measures of the extent of what brain changes you've achieved at the time when the measurements were made. But his second idea was extremely popular and extremely widely taken on board. He was looking for whatever functional behavioral characteristic he could measure was most sensitive to age-related change, presumably in the brain. So the second thing that Birren did in his lab with his associates Jack Botwinick and Joe Robbins was to test people on various single-occasion lab experiments. And of all the measures he took, he concluded that decision speed is the most sensitive index of age-associated cognitive change. This is generally accepted, but the question was, how do we take this further? How is it more than a marker for your cognitive status? Well, a third guiding idea was from Nathan Schock, who in the 1950s started a long-lasting Baltimore longitudinal study. This involved not just one-off lab experiments, but repeated testing over many years. I think in that study, as many as 30 years of large numbers of people. So the position when the Manchester Newcastle study was funded, obviously, what should we do? Obviously, time measurements were important, but we also needed to put in as much else as we could get away with, given the constraints of the time we had, about an hour a group, to test people. There was no hope then in brain imaging, and that only occurred in the 2000s, right at the end of the study, when we could, on a subset of people in Manchester, obtain brain images. First issue with longitudinal studies is what is the time course of rates of change in average performance? And that's how things look. You get a bumpy curve, and that's how things should be. So clearly God has screwed up again. The second issue was interindividual variability. People age physically, but also neurophysiologically and mentally at markedly different rates. And the variability increases as you examine groups of different ages. So the older the group you examine, the greater tends to be the difference between the best and the least good in the group. And can we relate this to physiological and social factors? Can we say why some people are lucky and other people are less so? A third issue is what factors predict survival. And we enrolled 6,000 Mancunians and Novocastrians, initially 55 to 92, and followed and documented all survivors over the next 30 years and recorded all deaths. We took 3 intelligence tests, the age 4, 1 and 2 in the Cattell Culture Fair, and we examined crystallized intelligence because there was evidence that crystallized intelligence from John Horn had pointed out that crystallized intelligence learned things like vocabulary decline less rapidly with age than does fluid intelligence, which is usually a time-based measure. And we also had verbal memory, visual memory, and information processing speed, again, speed tests. And we included health and social factors, so depression, 2 different inventories, general health. We had some examined by physicians, but mostly it was personal details and self-report, income, and so socioeconomic advantage, and dates and causes of death were also recorded for those who died. That's nearly half the study, and before the study ended in 2004. So what are the approaches you can adopt when you've got this massive data? One is to track the change backward from significant events, and death is clearly a significant event. It's hard to identify and quantify all the things that happen to people on their lives, so a useful device is to count time not forward from birth but backward from death. So this reveals what was called in the literature classically as a terminal drop, an unpleasant phrase in performance on nearly all mental tasks. And we had survivors and deceased from the Newcastle and Manchester study, and Mary Lunn and Danny Wong analysed these. And that's what you get. The W things here are those who withdrew. D stands for deceased. So at this point, these are the starting points for people who withdrew and were deceased. These were people who died and withdrew and deceased here when they reached there. This is withdrew on the first session. They weren't very happy with the study, and they might not have been very well either. And so it goes, but generally speaking, the nearer you get to death, or the nearer you get to abandoning the study, which is a proxy for not feeling so good about the world in general, and perhaps yourself in particular, the less your cognitive performance as previously measured has been, and the greater the decline you show. So another thing to do is to look at what things contribute towards survival. And Stephen Akile wrote this very optimistically titled paper in 2016 based on the Manchester study. And here you see the rank order of the conditions which have effect. Being a woman is a very good thing because it lowers your mortality risk like anything. Subjective health, up in the top right-hand corner of the screen, my screen anyway, is also a marvelous thing, and you have to be careful how you measure it. This was measured by asking questions, but we asked 3 sorts of questions. The wrong sort of question is, how do you compare with other people of your own age? And that gives you rather poor answers, because, as you might expect, because a lot of people who would have been your age are dead already, or who are in a worse plight than you, and so you feel pretty good about being alive. But if you're asked, how much have you changed during the last 5 years, then this is very informative, and it's a very good index of mortality. The others I won't go through in detail, but it just shows you what you can do, and it also shows you, if you don't need convincing already, that smoking is a bad thing and that processing speed, being fast, is a good thing. That and other analyses also show effects. Socioeconomic disadvantage, education, that goes of course very strongly with socioeconomic advantage rather than disadvantage. Illnesses we've dealt with already, loss of mobility which accompanies illnesses. And the psychological measures which matter are depression. The more depressed you are, the poorer your outlook. Intelligence, a decline in intelligence, and low intelligence has a poor outlook. And here we get information processing speed, the Birren variable, if you like, which is a very powerful index. So decline in intelligence scores is a risk factor, even after all these other influences are taken into account. So that those who showed declines of 10% or more over 10 years had 2 times, and those who showed declines of 20% or more had a 2.5 times increased risk of death. Participants who scored were constant over 4 years had no greater risk of dying than those who scored were increased by up to 20% by practice at the tests. So predictions for dropout were similar. These are statistics by Mary Lunn, and they bring up this idea of practice for the first time. More of that later. This is just to show you that you can, and we did, break down deaths by cause, and you get the usual things. You get heart disease and cancer have large effects. Combinations of these things have large effects too. What might be a surprise to some is that accidents, dying of an accident, is also a large effect, but you must bear in mind that most of the accidents suffered by older people which result in death are due to falls or acts of clumsiness which are due to motor incapability, which are due to being being in a pretty bad way generally. So to check that current gross brain measures predict previous rates of cognitive change, we've taken death as a gross brain measure, a dead brain. But if you take measures from live brains, which we were able to do in the 20th year of the study, and age-associated brain volume is the one I concentrate on here, that's not the most important. So you can track back from that, as we did from death, and you find much the same thing, that if you have high levels of brain shrinkage measured towards the end of the study, then these predict very well the rate over which you've declined during your previous years of testing, which could be up to 20, depending on your year of recruitment. And this is with Saeed Ibrahim, Mary Lunn, and Margaret Scott, and Neil Tacker, and others. But we've mentioned practice, and this has been the elephant in the room. It's been very widely neglected, and many, perhaps most published studies have ignored it. Walter Shire and Paul Baltus in the 1960s warned that during a study, when people were given the same tests again and again and again, they were likely to grow better at them. But this was very widely ignored because there was nothing to do about it at all. There were no statistics which could cope with it, and though Shire and Baltus identified the problem, they didn't suggest a solution. Once a solution had been found by Peter Diggle, it was very difficult to get our colleagues to accept this. And the first referees accused him of voodoo statistics. But it was a new invention in statistics, a new way to analyze and take amounts of practice effect into consideration. But fortunately, his statistics were available when pathologies were examined, and Mary Lunn and Danny Wong were able to incorporate them. And this showed some interesting things too, because if you looked at the rate at which people learned during tasks, the rate at which they improved declined the nearer they were to death and the worse their health. So this was the rate of improvement with practice on tasks during a longitudinal study is itself a very good marker for brain changes which are associated with with physiological changes which produce, of course, neurophysiological changes. Further than that, there's some optimism because, like all people launching longitudinal studies, when we wrote our original proposal, we drew a blanket over the fact that practice effects might occur because we'd been asked how we could cope with them. So we thought that we'd get away with it, as everybody thought they'd get away with it, by using very simple tasks, so simple that one thought that they wouldn't improve with practice, and administering these tasks at 4-year intervals. So you'd assume that a simple task, like a reaction time task, over a 4-year interval would show no improvement. You've guessed from what I've said already that you did. And indeed, we were able to take people who'd missed testing sessions, and so over intervals of 8 or even 10 years, they had, that is, intervals of 8 or 10 years between successive testings on very simple tasks like intelligence tests and memory tests and reaction time tests, they did show improvement. Though, as I will remind you, this improvement would be much less in people who were either nearing death or were suffering from known pathologies. So then at last we were able, at the end of the study in 2000, we were able to look at gross age-related changes in brain. Gross because image analysis is very intensive, and we could only at that time muster for the money we've got groups of about 150 people. So we obtained and used gross measurements, that is brain blood flow, gross brain volume, that's the difference between current skull volume, which we assumed would not change, and current brain volume, which would be less in an aged brain, and white matter lesion proliferation. And a paper with Dan Lunn and Ometse Mokape showed brain blood supply was the key to the other brain changes. So as brain blood supply changed, gross brain changes, specifically white matter intensities and overall brain shrinkage occurred, and declines in mental abilities in this study, specifically in decision speed, which turns out to be the most sensitive marker for brain changes, decline with brain changes. So you've got a causal sequence here. Blood supply to the brain keeps things going, and this accounts for perhaps the widest positive news in aging studies, which is that if you want to keep going into old age, you do as much exercise as you possibly can and keep your brain blood supply adequate. So how do you manage this analytically? It pays to look backward from current status to rates of previous changes. Now, the thing that is most associated with our sensitive index, remember, reaction times, and indeed also fluid intelligence, is white matter lesion intensity, and they're huge Dutch studies, mainly carried out in Rotterdam, and I've listed these for you. And I won't bother you with brain interpretation because I can't, but I'll show the pictures as a matter of pride. So measurement of overall white matter hyperintensities in the entire brain are more strongly associated with speed than with other measures. And the effects are stronger for white matter abundance in some areas, i.e. medial temporal areas, than in others. And overall white matter abundance also affects other mental abilities, notably verbal memory. So white matter in abundance is a key measure. It accounts for, its progress accounts for the decline, the amounts and the rate of decline in other measures, and particularly in information processing speed, and also of interest to all of us, of course, in intelligence too. And white matter intensity are to some extent selective because they affect performance on different tasks depending on which brain area they occur. If this hadn't been the case, of course, the data would have looked extremely suspicious because localization is the key idea in brain image studies. And here you get changes in verbal memory and age in ears at MRI and cardiovascular symptoms, so that with white matter intensities are associated with cardiovascular symptoms and with age in ears, and changes in verbal memory decline as white matter intensities increase. So that the strength of the associations is really remarkable because white matter lesion abundance accounts for nearly all of age-related changes in GF and speed, and that is for about 98% or more of the proportion of variance in speed that is associated with differences in people's ages. So that 98% of the age-related changes in speed are accounted for by measures of white matter abundance. And of course, looking backwards, white matter abundance at a particular time, a paper with Saeed Ibrahim and Mary Lunn, account for the rate of change previously. So brain blood flow and gross brain shrinkage are combined. Effects of intelligence are almost entirely mediated by the effects on processing speed. That is, if you enter both gross brain shrinkage and white matter lesion intensities and brain blood flow into your analyses, then you can account for declines in intelligence and in processing speed, but the decline in intelligence is almost entirely accounted for by processing speed. It's entirely related to the effect of processing speed. At any age, processing speed and intelligence are strongly correlated. Particular interest that after differences in processing speed are taken into account, the effect of age on intelligence are almost completely removed, and the proportions on the different intelligence tests we used are quite similar. So it's between 89 and 99 for the Cattell, 80 to 96 for the AH4, and 98 to 100% of AH42. Right, and so we at last reach the summary. As we grow old, our health declines, pathologies increase, brain blood supply reduces, and death becomes more likely. Pathologies reduce brain blood supply and so global brain efficiency. These effects cause declines in mental abilities. Declines in mental abilities are good markers, that's not direct causes of progress towards mortality and of rates of further declines. The most sensitive cognitive markers that we could find are declines, not overall lifetime levels of intelligence or of decision speed. This is worth stressing because if you're slow, either in the sense of being not very bright or of having slow reaction times, this is not a counterindication of itself. It is the change in these measurements which matters, not their level, lifetime level. So differences in speed predict between 80 and 100% of that proportion of the differences in intelligence between individuals that are associated with differences in their ages. And differences in speed are strongly associated with gross age-related changes in the brain. For example, best example is white matter hyperintensities that seem to be driven by age-related declines in cerebral blood flow, which is, to reassure you, increased by exercise, which incidentally I never take.